The Dutch in America and New Amsterdam, Part 1, The Birth of a New World Colony. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean in the early 1600s, restless, gray, and untamed. Wooden ships creak under the weight of salted air and the dreams of empires. To the east lies Europe, a continent bursting with ambition, to the west, a mysterious world that promised gold, land, and freedom. Most people remember the English settlers, Jamestown, Plymouth, the Pilgrims and Puritans. But before Manhattan became the heartbeat of America, before Wall Street rose from its cobblestones, there was another flag flying over the island, orange, white, and blue. This is the story of the Dutch in America, and the birth of New Amsterdam, the city that would one day become New York. In the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic was unlike any other power in Europe. While Spain and Portugal fought for gold and souls, and England battled to plant colonies for crown and church, the Dutch were doing something different, they were trading. Holland was small, its land reclaimed from the sea by dikes and windmills, but its people were bold, pragmatic, and fiercely independent. The Dutch Republic had recently broken free from Spanish rule after 80 years of bloody struggle. Now, in their newfound freedom, they turned outward, to the oceans, to commerce, to discovery. Amsterdam, their capital, became the richest port in the world. Its canals glittered with ships returning from every corner of the globe, the East Indies, Africa, Brazil. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, founded in 1602, was already making fortunes trading spices and silk. But across the Atlantic, another dream was stirring, a western route to Asia, and perhaps new territories to exploit. In 1609, the Dutch East India Company hired an English navigator, Henry Hudson, to seek a passage to Asia through the icy waters north of Europe. But Hudson had his own ideas. After weeks of fruitless sailing through the Arctic, he turned west. He believed he might find a shorter route to the Pacific by cutting across North America. His small ship, the Half Moon, braved storms and mutiny to reach the coast of the New World. In September 1609, Hudson sailed into a vast natural harbor. The air smelled of pine and salt. Towering trees lined the shores. The local people, the Lenape, part of the Algonquian family, watched cautiously as the foreign vessel dropped anchor. Hudson and his crew rowed ashore, meeting the native inhabitants with cautious curiosity. They traded trinkets for furs, steel knives for maize and tobacco. Hudson wrote in his journal of goodly lands, well wooded and watered. Then, he sailed north up a great river, wide, calm, and majestic, that wound deep into the continent. He hoped it might lead to China. It didn't. But the river would forever bear his name, the Hudson River. Hudson never found the passage to Asia. His crew, weary and starving, mutinied the following year in the Arctic and cast him adrift to die. Yet his voyage changed the course of history. He had revealed to the Dutch a land rich in fur, forests, and opportunity. A place where trade could thrive, if only they had the will to claim it. In 1621, 12 years after Hudson's voyage, the Dutch West India Company, WIC, was founded. Its mission, to expand Dutch power in the Atlantic, to trade, to colonize, and to challenge the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Unlike the English colonies, built by settlers seeking religious freedom, the Dutch effort was entirely commercial. This was not about faith. It was about profit. The WIC was granted a monopoly over Dutch trade in the Americas and Africa. Its directors, wealthy merchants known as the Lords 19, drew a map of a new colony that stretched from the Delaware River to Cape Cod. They called it New Netherland. The company sent ships across the Atlantic, carrying settlers, soldiers, and supplies. They built Fort Nassau near present-day Albany and later Fort Orange upriver, both serving as trading posts for beaver pelts, the soft gold of the 17th century. Every hat in Europe seemed to require American beaver fur, and the Dutch were determined to control that trade. But at the heart of their colony stood a small island at the mouth of the Hudson, Manhattan. It was there that they would build their fortress, their port, and their dream. In 1626, Peter Minuit, the director of New Netherland, arrived to take charge. To secure the island of Manhattan, he negotiated with the local Lenape people. The story goes that he bought the entire island for goods worth 60 guilders, often said to be about $24 in modern money. The truth is more complex, and far more interesting. To the Dutch, it was a purchase, a legal transaction. To the Lenape, it was more like an agreement to share land and resources, something no one could truly own. This misunderstanding would echo through centuries of American history. Nonetheless, the Dutch built Fort Amsterdam at the island's southern tip, today's Battery Park. They laid out dirt streets, wooden houses, and a defensive wall across the northern edge of the settlement. That wall would later give its name to Wall Street. Around the fort, a small but diverse community began to grow. Sailors, farmers, fur traders, carpenters, and soldiers. Men and women from across Europe, Dutch, Germans, Scandinavians, Walloons from Belgium, and even a few English families, settled together. By 1630, Africans were brought as enslaved laborers, though some would later earn their freedom. New Amsterdam became a melting pot long before the phrase existed. What made New Amsterdam different from the English colonies was its spirit. It was not a Puritan theocracy, nor a penal outpost. It was a city of trade, tolerance, and opportunity. The Dutch Republic itself was famous for its religious freedom. Jews fleeing the Inquisition, Protestants escaping Catholic persecution, and even Catholics seeking safety found refuge in Amsterdam, and in New Amsterdam as well. Here, you could pray as you pleased, as long as you didn't disrupt business. The settlers farmed the fertile lands of Long Island, Staten Island, and the Hudson Valley. Ships loaded with furs, timber, and grain sailed back to Amsterdam. In return came fine cloth, tools, wine, and European luxuries. The Dutch also established alliances with native nations, particularly the Iroquois Confederacy to the north, to secure the fur trade. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy and competition. The Iroquois sought European weapons and goods, while the Dutch sought pelts. Mutual need kept the peace, for a time. The directors of the West India Company had grand ambitions, but their colony was small, scattered, and hard to manage. New Amsterdam was a rough port, full of muddy streets, drunken sailors, and quarrelsome settlers. Company officials often complained that colonists were lazy or disobedient. Settlers complained that the company was greedy and corrupt. In 1638, the company relaxed its monopoly on trade, allowing private merchants to trade freely. That decision transformed the colony's economy. New Amsterdam began to flourish as ships came and went from every direction. Taverns sprang up along the waterfront, markets bustled with fish and furs, and the Dutch language mingled with a dozen others. Life was far from easy, but it was freewheeling, diverse, and vibrant, a preview of the city it would one day become. When you picture New York today, skyscrapers, taxis, Wall Street brokers shouting at dawn, it's hard to imagine its beginnings as a muddy little Dutch village of 300 souls. But even then, you can see the outlines of what New York would become. The Dutch brought with them their culture of commerce, their tolerance, their urban planning, and even their love of freedom. They built canals and windmills. They held public markets and granted land to farmers along the Hudson, called patroons, who would become the colonial elite. They welcomed strangers and spoke many languages. They were not perfect, they enslaved Africans, fought brutal wars with native tribes, and often prioritized profit over justice. Yet in their own way, they laid the foundations for America's first cosmopolitan city. By the mid-1630s, New Netherland was still a small outpost in a vast and contested world. To the north, the English in Massachusetts were multiplying rapidly. To the south, the Swedes were eyeing the Delaware River. And all around them, native nations were watching, negotiating, and resisting. But the Dutch believed they could hold their ground. They had trade, they had tolerance, and they had the spirit of merchants who saw opportunity in every tide. In our next chapter, we'll meet the man who would try to turn this fragile colony into a stronghold, the one-legged, iron-willed Governor Peter Stuyvesant, and witness how New Amsterdam clashed with its neighbors, grew into a bustling town, and faced its destiny when the English fleet sailed into the harbor. The story of New Amsterdam isn't just about colonization. It's about the birth of a city that would one day call itself New York, but would never forget the Dutch blood that first built it. The Dutch in America and New Amsterdam, Part 2, Stuyvesant City. The year is 1647. A ship sails slowly into the harbor of Manhattan. Its sails are patched, its crew weary, and standing proudly on deck is a man who walks with a wooden leg capped in silver. His name is Peter Stuyvesant, the new Director General of New Netherland. He has come to save a colony on the edge of chaos. When Stuyvesant arrived, New Amsterdam was far from the orderly trading post the Dutch West India Company imagined. It was a messy, noisy, quarrelsome village of a few hundred people. The settlers complained about unfair taxes, the company's monopoly, and lack of protection from native attacks or English encroachment. Morale was low. Lawlessness was high. Taverns outnumbered churches. Peter Stuyvesant, proud, strict, and deeply religious, intended to change all that. Born in the Netherlands around 1610, he had served as a soldier and governor in the Caribbean before losing his leg in battle. The wooden replacement gave him a limp and an aura of defiance. He ruled with the confidence of a man who believed in divine order, and in his own authority. When he first saw New Amsterdam, he reportedly muttered, "This is a sink of iniquity." And he was determined to clean it up. Stuyvesant began by enforcing discipline and law. He repaired the old fort, strengthened the colony's defenses, and created a small militia. He ordered the construction of a stone church inside Fort Amsterdam, and he personally led prayers on Sundays. He banned drunkenness and fighting in the streets. He cracked down on illegal trade and demanded loyalty to the Dutch Reformed Church. To the rough-and-tumble settlers, his strictness felt almost tyrannical. But to Stuyvesant, it was necessary. The colony, he believed, was God's trust, and he was its guardian. Under his rule, New Amsterdam began to change. Streets were straightened and paved. Wooden fences were replaced with sturdier barriers. A public school was established. A sense of order, however fragile, took root. Still, the colony's diversity, and its stubborn independence, constantly tested his patience. By the mid-17th century, New Amsterdam had become one of the most diverse settlements in the New World. While Puritan Boston was almost entirely English and Protestant, Manhattan was a swirl of nationalities and languages. Dutch, German, French, Scandinavian, English, and by now, African. Records show that in 1643, the colony had fewer than 500 inhabitants, yet they spoke 18 different languages. Sailors cursed in Dutch and Portuguese. Traders bargained in French. Children grew up mixing words from 3 tongues in a single sentence. Stuyvesant saw this as disorder, the settlers saw it as life. Even religion was varied. The colony hosted Lutherans, Jews, Quakers, and Catholics, people who had fled persecution in Europe. When Stuyvesant tried to ban some of their worship, the settlers revolted in spirit. Petitions poured into the Dutch West India Company, which reminded him that freedom of conscience was one of the Republic's greatest principles. In 1657, a group of English settlers living in a Dutch town called Flushing, today part of Queens, wrote a remarkable protest known as the Flushing Remonstrance. They defended the right of Quakers to worship freely, declaring, "If any of these persons come in love unto us, we cannot in conscience lay violent hands upon them." Those words, written in a tiny colony decades before the American Revolution, became one of the earliest declarations of religious liberty in North America. Even Stuyvesant couldn't silence that spirit. Stuyvesant's rule was strict, but it was also practical. He knew that New Netherland was surrounded by rivals. To the north, English settlers from Connecticut and Massachusetts were expanding rapidly. To the south, the Swedes had built New Sweden along the Delaware River. And all around, native nations watched these Europeans build forts and fences across their lands. To defend the colony, Stuyvesant ordered the construction of a 12-foot-high wall across the northern edge of the town, roughly along today's Wall Street. It wasn't elegant, but it marked a line. Beyond this wall lay wilderness and potential enemies, inside, the fragile safety of Dutch order. Behind the wall, the town grew denser. Merchants built warehouses. Blacksmiths clanged in their forges. Carts rolled through muddy streets. Markets filled with fish from the East River, apples from Long Island, and tobacco from the Hudson Valley. The smell of tar, salt, and smoke hung in the air. If you'd walked down the main street, Breedweg, or Broadway, you would have passed taverns, stables, a church, and a small gallows. Yes, Broadway was already there. In 1655, Stuyvesant turned his attention to the south. The Swedes, led by Governor Johan Rising, had taken Dutch trading posts along the Delaware River, claiming the region as their own. The Dutch West India Company ordered Stuyvesant to take it back. With 7 ships and hundreds of soldiers, he sailed to the Delaware. The Swedes surrendered after a short siege, and New Sweden became part of New Netherland. The victory restored Dutch pride, but it also stretched their resources thin. During his absence, disaster struck New Amsterdam. While the men were away fighting, a group of native warriors attacked farms and outlying villages along the Hudson, killing dozens. It was a painful reminder that the colony's survival depended on delicate alliances, and mutual respect that was often broken. Stuyvesant tried to restore peace, signing new treaties with neighboring tribes. But the scars remained. While New Amsterdam prided itself on tolerance and diversity, it was also built on the backs of enslaved Africans. The Dutch West India Company had imported enslaved men and women since the 1620s to build the fortifications, roads, and farms. They cut timber, laid the first streets, and helped construct the wall itself. Yet the Dutch system of slavery was complex. Some enslaved Africans were later granted a status called half-freedom. They could live with their families and farm their own land, but they had to pay taxes and work for the company when called upon. A small community of free black families took root just north of the town, their descendants later playing important roles in the city's history. So even in its earliest days, New York's diversity was shadowed by inequality, freedom and bondage side by side, opportunity and oppression intertwined. If there was one thing that united the settlers, it was trade. Furs, tobacco, timber, and grain flowed through the port. Merchants bartered for sugar from the Caribbean, salt from Curaçao, and rum from Africa. Ships came and went, bearing flags of a dozen nations. The Dutch were masters of commerce. They kept detailed ledgers, signed meticulous contracts, and invented some of the world's first stock exchanges. The spirit of capitalism was already alive on Manhattan's waterfront. The colony's motto could have been, "God is good, but trade is better." Every deal, every ship, every barrel of beaver pelts tied the tiny outpost closer to the global network of Dutch wealth. But that same success drew jealous eyes from across the Atlantic. To the Dutch, New Netherland was their rightful colony, discovered by Hudson, settled by their traders, protected by their forts. To the English, it was an inconvenient wedge between their northern colonies in New England and their southern ones in Virginia and Maryland. For decades, English settlers from Connecticut had been creeping westward, claiming Dutch lands and founding towns like Stamford and Greenwich. Stuyvesant protested to the company and to the English governors, but he lacked soldiers to enforce his claims. Diplomacy could only delay the inevitable. By the early 1660s, the balance of power in the Atlantic had shifted. The English navy was ascendant. The Dutch, though still wealthy, were overextended, fighting wars in Europe and struggling to defend far-flung colonies. And across the sea, in London, King Charles II had his eyes on the prize. He planned to give the region, all of New Netherland, to his brother, the Duke of York. In the summer of 1664, 4 English warships appeared off the coast of Manhattan. Their cannons glinted in the sun as they anchored in the harbor. They carried hundreds of soldiers and a simple message: surrender. The people of New Amsterdam panicked. They had no army, no reinforcements from Holland, and few weapons. Stuyvesant, proud and furious, wanted to fight. He limped through the streets with his silver-tipped leg, shouting, "I'd rather be carried out dead than surrender this place." But the townspeople disagreed. Merchants feared losing their goods, families feared destruction, and even soldiers saw no point in dying for a distant company that cared more about profit than protection. After tense negotiations, Stuyvesant finally signed the Articles of Capitulation. They guaranteed freedom of religion, property, and trade for all inhabitants, terms surprisingly generous for a conquered people. And just like that, without a single shot fired, the flag of the Netherlands came down. The English flag, the Union Jack, rose above Fort Amsterdam. The colony of New Netherland became New York, named for the Duke of York. And the city of New Amsterdam had a new name, New York City. Stuyvesant returned to Holland in disgrace, though later he came back to live quietly on his farm in what's now the East Village. He died there in 1672 and was buried in the churchyard of St. Mark's, which still stands today. But though the Dutch rule had ended, their spirit never left. The laws, street patterns, and even attitudes they left behind continued to shape New York for centuries. Dutch tolerance became American pluralism. Dutch trade became Wall Street capitalism. Dutch stubbornness became New York resilience. The story of Peter Stuyvesant and New Amsterdam is more than just a colonial episode. It's the story of how a merchant outpost on a tiny island grew into a city that would change the world. But our tale isn't over yet. In Part 3, we'll follow what happened after the English takeover, how Dutch culture endured beneath the surface, how their farms, families, and names shaped the new city, and how the legacy of New Amsterdam still echoes through every street and skyline of modern New York. Because history didn't end with the lowering of a flag. In many ways, that's when it truly began. The Dutch in America and New Amsterdam, Part 3, The Legacy of New Amsterdam. The orange, white, and blue flag had fallen. The Union Jack waved above Fort Amsterdam. The colony was no longer New Netherland, it was now New York, a gift from King Charles II to his brother, the Duke of York. But though the name changed, the soul of the city did not. The people, Dutch, African, German, French, Scandinavian, Jewish, English, remained. They still traded, still prayed, still argued in the same muddy streets. The heartbeat of commerce did not skip a beat. This was not a conquest that erased. It was one that transformed, and the Dutch spirit would continue to shape America in ways few could have imagined. When the English took over in 1664, there was no massacre, no mass exodus. Under the Articles of Capitulation, the Dutch residents were guaranteed their property, their faith, and their way of life. Governor Richard Nicolls, the first English ruler of New York, proved pragmatic. He understood that the Dutch were skilled traders and farmers, valuable to the crown. So he let them stay. Dutch laws remained largely intact. Dutch merchants kept their warehouses and ships. Even Dutch street names lingered. Breedweg became Broadway, Herengracht became Broad Street, and the Dutch word Bowerage, meaning farm, gave its name to the Bowery. The English flag may have flown above the fort, but the rhythm of life, trade, tolerance, hustle, stayed unmistakably Dutch. If you had walked through New York in the late 1600s, you would still have met familiar Dutch names: Van Cortlandt, Van Rensselaer, Stuyvesant, Schuyler, Roosevelt. These families became part of the city's DNA. They owned farms and estates stretching up the Hudson River, built windmills on Staten Island, traded furs and grain, and intermarried with the English newcomers. Over time, they formed the foundation of New York's elite, not through royal titles, but through business, persistence, and land. In the Hudson Valley, the patroonships, vast estates granted to Dutch landowners in the early days, continued to dominate for generations. Tenants farmed the land, paying rent in wheat and livestock. The system would eventually fade, but its imprint lingered in the great manor houses that still dot the region today. Among these names, one would echo all the way to the White House: Roosevelt. The family's ancestor, Claes Martens Zen van Roosevelt, emigrated from the Netherlands to New Amsterdam in the 1640s. Centuries later, his descendants, Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would become two of America's most influential presidents. That's Dutch New York in a nutshell, a seed planted in muddy colonial soil that grew into national leadership. One of the most remarkable inheritances from the Dutch era was religious tolerance. Long before the First Amendment guaranteed freedom of religion, New Amsterdam had already lived it, not perfectly, but ahead of its time. Jews fleeing Portugal were allowed to stay in 1654, despite Stuyvesant's protests. Lutherans and Quakers worshipped quietly, often against the governor's wishes, yet they endured. After the English takeover, that tolerance didn't vanish, it deepened. The Dutch Reformed Church, founded in 1628, continued to flourish and today survives as the Reformed Church in America. The idea that faith was a private matter, that commerce and conscience could coexist, became a cornerstone of New York identity, and, eventually, of American democracy. The multicultural, multi-faith character of modern America, from synagogues in Brooklyn to mosques in Queens, traces its roots back to those early Dutch settlers who believed the marketplace was big enough for everyone. Even after English became dominant, the Dutch language lingered for over a century. In villages along the Hudson, sermons were preached in Dutch well into the 1700s. Children spoke it at home, and records show Dutch phrases creeping into colonial English. Words like cookie, from koekje, coleslaw, from coolslaw, and stoop, from stoop, all Dutch gifts to American speech, remain part of the language today. Even the friendly habit of shaking hands after a deal, that's straight from Dutch merchant culture. When you walk through New York and hear 20 languages in one block, that's not new. That's been New York since 1625. The English may have taken New York, but the Dutch didn't forget. During the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1673, a Dutch fleet under Admiral Evertsen and Banks recaptured the city. For a single year, New York was again New Orange, named after the Dutch royal family. Peter Stuyvesant's old soldiers cheered, and the Dutch flag once again fluttered over Fort Amsterdam. But the triumph was short-lived. A year later, in 1674, peace was signed in Europe, and the city was returned to England for good. The Dutch recognized that their strength lay not in colonies, but in commerce, ships, trade, and finance. They had already transformed global capitalism. New York would simply carry that legacy forward under a new name. The Dutch were master builders, engineers who had tamed the sea with dikes and canals. They applied the same precision to their colonial towns. The grid of Lower Manhattan, the narrow, winding streets near Wall Street, was laid out in the Dutch era. The custom of public markets, where farmers and fishermen sold goods openly, came from Dutch civic life. Even the idea of a city council, where citizens debated taxes and ordinances, was a Dutch import. They brought with them a worldview that cities worked best not by royal decree, but by community negotiation, what the Dutch called polderen, or working together despite differences. That cooperative spirit would later shape everything from New York's business culture to its politics. If one place captures the Dutch legacy perfectly, it's Wall Street. The name, of course, comes from Stuyvesant's wall, built to protect the town from invasion. When the wall was torn down in the late 1600s, the open space became a marketplace. Traders gathered there to buy and sell shares in ships, cargoes, and companies, just as their Dutch ancestors had done in Amsterdam. In 1792, over a century after the Dutch flag fell, a group of merchants signed the Buttonwood Agreement under a tree on Wall Street, founding what would become the New York Stock Exchange. In that moment, the spirit of the Dutch East and West India Companies, the world's first multinational corporations, was reborn in American form. From beaver pelts to billion-dollar bonds, the line of heritage runs straight and strong. The Dutch also left their mark in brick and stone. Their architecture, steep gabled roofs, thick walls, large hearths, spread throughout the Hudson Valley. You can still see it in towns like Kingston, Hurley, and Albany, where old Dutch farmhouses stand proudly against the landscape. They loved art, good food, and family gatherings. They celebrated Sinterklaas, the feast of Saint Nicholas, with sweets and gifts for children, a tradition that evolved, over time, into the American Santa Claus. So when children hang stockings by the fireplace each December, they're keeping a piece of New Amsterdam alive. What did the Dutch truly give America? Not just fur, ships, or architecture, but an attitude. They believed in pragmatism over dogma, trade over tyranny, and diversity over division. They saw the world as a network of opportunity, not a battlefield of faith. Their colonies weren't perfect, they enslaved people, clashed with natives, and chased profit relentlessly, but they left behind a culture of enterprise and inclusion. Centuries later, those same values would define New York City: bold, diverse, restless, free. When immigrants poured into Ellis Island in the 19th century, they were walking into a city built on Dutch tolerance. When skyscrapers rose from the bedrock, they stood upon Dutch foundations. In a sense, New Amsterdam never truly died. It simply changed its name. The canals became avenues. The merchant's ledger became a stock exchange. The wooden fort became a metropolis of glass and steel. But the essence, the idea that here, in this place, people of every background could come to trade, live, and build something new, that is the beating heart of New York. And through New York, that spirit spread across the nation, the belief that success comes not from birthright or blood, but from courage, skill, and a willingness to work with others. That, more than anything, is the Dutch legacy in America. If you ever walk through Battery Park, where Fort Amsterdam once stood, close your eyes for a moment. Hear the hum of traffic, the roar of the subway below, the chatter of tourists and traders. Now imagine the same spot in 1626, gulls circling above, waves lapping at the shore, a handful of settlers hauling barrels off a ship. Different sounds, same spirit. From that tiny Dutch outpost grew a city that became the financial capital of the world, a place where people still come chasing the same promise that drew the Dutch across the ocean: opportunity. So when you hear the words, New York, remember that before it was new, it was new. And before it was York, it was Amsterdam. The Dutch may have ruled for only 40 years, but in those 40 years, they planted an idea that outlasted empires. That freedom, trade, and diversity could build not just a colony, but a civilization. And that concludes our three-part journey through the Dutch in America and New Amsterdam. From the voyage of Henry Hudson, to Peter Stuyvesant's iron rule, to the enduring legacy that shaped New York and the nation. The story of the Dutch in America is the story of how modern America began. With ambition, tolerance, and the courage to build something lasting on the edge of the unknown. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.